this year went by at a massive speed. So we're already in October. And if we look at the sessions that we went through throughout this year, we started off with general questions. Then we went through everything from inspections to application process to maintenance to absolutely everything, early cancellation by the landlord, early cancellation by the tenant, bridge and cancellation, evictions. I think we've covered so much ground, and we've actually already started talking about training sessions for next year. And with most of the groups that I'm doing the training for, we have decided that we need to get to a more practical sort of type of training, more question and answer type on the go things. But because of the WhatsApp groups, I think we are actually fulfilling that need quite impressively. But if you have any specific suggestions about the trainings for next year, please let me know. Just pop me a mail or talk to your training coordinator or whatever, just so we get a few topics out there that you might still feel we need to train on. But we still have a last session for November. But for today, we are talking about quite a few nitty-gritty things that we encounter in the rental game. And let's get going on that. The first thing is actually absconsion. So the things that we've decided to talk about today is very practical things that happen every single day to every single rental agent, and you're wondering, what do I do with this right now? So absconsion, let's start by defining absconding. What is this? So we deem somebody to have absconded if he hasn't been to the property in quite some time. Now, what is quite some time? I don't know, because it depends on the facts. If you have a property and you know your tenant is actually based in, let's say, Pretoria, but he is renting this property from you in Bloemfontein. His family and everybody lives in Pretoria, and he's renting this place for work purposes in Bloemfontein. If that guy is suddenly not there for a period of 3 weeks, we can't really draw a logical conclusion that the guy absconded. He's probably just hanging out with his family in Pretoria while he's on leave or something like that. These agreements in the past definitely required almost permanent tenancy, and that is not the case. There shouldn't be provisions in a lease agreement requiring permanent occupation, because you can't tell somebody to stay in a property permanently. You're not allowed to go away for a week. You are allowed to go away for a week or 2 or 3, whatever the case might be, even longer than that for work purposes or holiday or whatever the case might be. Absconsion is where we can clearly see this tenant is not of the intention to come back. If there's a fridge that is still filled with milk and stuff like that, you can see this person is living here. The chances of the person absconding is slim to none. But at the same time, you are not going to sit with a situation like that when you can still communicate with the tenant. So if you see the tenant is gone, the grass is this long, there's like one very dodgy chair left in the property and a mattress that looks like, you know, it's been there for 59 years and only the dog's been sleeping on it and nothing else, your assumption can be that the tenant absconded. Now, I am very reluctant to assume that somebody absconded. Why? Because if you make the assumption that the person absconded incorrectly, you're going to act illegally in accidentally getting to an illegal lockout because you think this person absconded. What the Act is telling us, so the Rental Housing Act, Section 5(3), subsection 0 there, says, should a tenant vacate the dwelling before expiration of the lease without notice to the landlord, the lease is deemed to have expired on the date that the landlord established that the tenant had vacated the dwelling, but in such event, the landlord retains all his or her rights arising from the tenant's breach of the lease agreement. Okay, so let's pause for a second and let's talk about Section 14 of the Consumer Protection Act. So if you have to do a refresher on this, remember, you do have access to all the old training videos. I think we did the cancellation training, early cancellation, Section 14 of the CPA training in July this year. This is not that. Why am I saying this? Early cancellation is an action that a tenant takes in terms of Section 14 of the CPA, and he communicates with the landlord by giving him 20 business days notice. I am cancelling the agreement. I am enforcing my right in terms of Section 14 of the CPA. I am going to leave, and you are entitled to charge an early cancellation penalty as the landlord. In a case of an absconsion, that is not that, because there is no communication. Absconding by definition means the person is just gone. His stuff is gone, most of his stuff is gone, and you can't get hold of him. And this is why the Rental Housing Act comes in with Section 530 that says that the contract will deemed to have been cancelled once the landlord established that the tenant absconded. But watch what the Act says. He says, but the landlord retains all his rights that he has against the tenant for breach of the agreement. So absconsion, in terms of the Act, is a form of breach. So it's very different from Section 14. You know, when we talk about early cancellation by the tenant, I always say, remember, the tenant is not in breach when he cancels the agreement early. He's not breaking the lease. He's not doing anything bad. He's enforcing a right he has in law. Absconsion is different. Absconsion is a form of breach. So how do we act against this? So usually when we have a breach, we know what to do. We need to send a letter of demand, give the tenant 20 business days to remedy his breach. If he doesn't, we can cancel. And that is in a case where the breach is non-payment of rent, if the breach is non-compliance with conduct rules, whatever the case might be, that is a form of breach. And in terms of Section 14 of the CPA, we need to give that tenant 20 business days notice to remedy the breach, and only if he doesn't can we cancel the agreement. Or if Section 14 does not apply, we need to give him 7 days, and if he doesn't remedy his breach, we can cancel the agreement. Absconsion, the Act says, the Rental Housing Act says, if somebody absconded, the lease is deemed to have been cancelled. So even though the Act says that this is a form of breach, the Act overrides the rules of law of contract, not requiring us then to do a letter of demand, because what do you demand? Mr. Tenant, you absconded, you have 20 business days to return to the premises. That is weird and illogical in every single sense of the word. So I would definitely, at that moment, when you establish that, do a letter to the tenant and say, Mr. Tenant, we see that you have absconded. Section 530 of the Rental Housing Act now says our lease agreement is deemed to have been cancelled, but the landlord still retains all his rights in terms of the lease agreement. What does this mean? The tenant will be responsible for loss of income suffered by the landlord. So the reason this is the case is the landlord won't be able to place a new tenant just like that. He's going to have to advertise, and for all the time that this premises is standing vacant during the time that this particular tenant was supposed to be in the property, he will be responsible for that amount that is due to the landlord, and the landlord can claim that money from the tenant and withhold that from the deposit. So it's very important to keep this in mind. But what do we do if there's a lot of things left in the premises? So say, for instance, you get there, you see that one dodgy bed is still there, and there's a microwave that's starting to rust. There's still a few things left, but there's no clothes, there's no nothing that you can see the guy is still living here. The toothbrush is gone, so you know he's gone. What do we do then? So I have I'm so sorry, that was load shedding. They had dropped the power there. There we go. Look at that. It is back. So what do we do in a situation like that? We can't just throw somebody's items away. The fact that the Act says this agreement is now deemed to be cancelled doesn't mean I can go in and just chuck everything out. We need to act in a way when it comes to this. And how do we do that? We have a case that we recently had, and actually you will see there from our reference, it's exactly from Claire that took good care of you while I was on leave recently. So Claire did this letter very recently, the 3rd of September, and this is what we do in a situation like this. In this context, what happened in this letter, in this particular matter, we've sent a letter of demand to the tenant that wasn't paying rent on the 19th of August. On the 3rd of September, it came to our knowledge that the tenant is no longer in the property, but there is still items that's left in the property. So if you look at paragraph 3, it is our instruction that you have failed to remove all your furniture, appliances, and or other personal items. We accordingly confirm the lawful cancellation of the lease agreement between the parties arising from you vacating the property. So this is 100% on the back of the Rental Housing Act. Now what we're saying is you need to come and fetch your stuff, because if the items are left in the premises and the landlord removes it, it could be seen as a theft, and we don't want that. So what we're saying is, you, Mr. Tenant, now have 3 business days to come and fetch your stuff. If you do not do that, we're going to deem that you have absconded, and we can dispose of the items as we see fit. In this particular case, the tenant actually did come in, came to fetch her things, and everybody is happy. If it didn't happen, if the tenant didn't come and on the back of this letter fetch the items, the landlord could have got rid of it, donated to charity, or whatever the case might be. And this letter is 100% the reason why the landlord can say, I'm not guilty of theft because I gave you an opportunity to come and fetch your items. I had no intention of stealing anything. All right, then something very important. So that's absconsion. I think we've got that. How do we deal with that? Quite easy. Agreements deemed to be cancelled, and you can still claim your early cancellation penalty. All right. Let me just go one back. Ansi, can I please ask you to mute your mic? Thank you. All right, so let's get to the late penalty or admin charges. What this is obviously when a tenant pays late, you want to discourage him from paying late. So you want to bring in a penalty or some sort of an action to get him to actually pay on time. But what does the unfair practice regulation say? So this is not the Rental Housing Act. This is the unfair practice regulations to the Rental Housing Act. And regulation 3 of the unfair practice regulations, 3 sub-regulation I to be specific, C1, specifically says a lease agreement must not include any provisions which imposes a penalty for late payment of rent, whether or not the penalty takes the form of an administrative charge or any other form other than interest. So what the Act is saying is there's no way that we can charge an early cancellation, that we can charge a late payment penalty, even in the form of an admin charge. And because this is part of the unfair practice regulations to the Rental Housing Act, this is law and we cannot contract out of it. And the reason why the Act is so specific on it can't take any other form is I have seen many people trying to get around this by saying the rent will, for instance, be 12,500 Rand a month, but if you pay before the 30th of the month, it will only be 12. Now, the truth is that is not a discount. That is actually a penalty. So it doesn't matter which way you frame this. The Act is very clear. You need to charge the rent in the amount that it should be. If the tenant pays late, the only thing you can charge on that is interest, and the interest we can charge is then regulated in terms of the Interest Act. Interest Act says that we can charge 2% per month to a maximum of 24% per annum. So you charge that prorated for the amount of days that the tenant has paid late, and that's the only thing we can charge. So nothing else, no late payment penalties, no admin charges. The only thing we can charge is the interest. Then, changes to the premises, is this allowed? So what are we talking about here? A change to a premises can be anything from putting up a new curtain rail or, you know, painting the place or whatever the case might be. Is a tenant allowed to do this? Well, I don't know, because this will be regulated by the lease agreement. If the lease agreement says, Mr. Tenant, you are allowed to make to make changes and amend things in the property on the landlord's written acceptance of that and consent, then you can do it, but you need consent. What happens then? If the expense of the change is substantial, so it's not a washer that's getting fixed, which is anyway a consumable that the tenant has to fix. If it is, for instance, the tenant wants the place to be painted a different color, him and the landlord agreed the tenant will pay for this, but when he leaves the property, he doesn't have to paint it back to white or whatever the original color was. Then the tenant will not have a claim against the landlord for those changes to the premises. However, if the tenant says, Mr. Landlord, I want to build a deck outside of the sliding door towards the swimming pool, can I do this? But can you and I go in half? So I pay only half of my rent and the other half I use to build the deck that I'm willing to build. I'll pay for the labor, I'll be in on that, but then it becomes your property. Then the tenant can't have any further claim against the landlord than that item or amount that they've agreed to. However, if the tenant just carries on and does something, he builds a deck or he puts up a shaded net or something without the consent of the landlord, even in a case where the lease agreement is silent on this, the tenant can never, ever deduct those amounts or claim that amount from the landlord. Why? Because he changed the landlord's property without his consent. To be honest, the chances of the landlord having a claim, a damages claim against the tenant for the changes he made to the premises is actually higher than the chance of the tenant claiming that back from the landlord. Because you can't just go in and change items in a premises without having the consent to do that. I recently had a case, well, I actually still do. I think you guys might have seen a bit of that actually on Carte Blanche, where somebody started developing on somebody else's land. This developer is not the owner of the land. The developer doesn't have a joint venture agreement or any agreement with the owner of the land. He just started building on the land. Now, if you look at a case like that, you can't possibly try and imagine that the developer that's now just building randomly on somebody else's land will have a claim against that owner of the property for the improvements he made on the land. Maybe the owner of the land didn't want a development there, which is probably why he doesn't have a development there. And you can't just build on somebody else's land and then say, oh, it's my property and you need to compensate me for the improvements I've made on your land. That's not how it works. The same principle applies in the context of a rental. If a tenant decides, you know what would look amazing is if I put a built-in braai on the stoop. The fact that it's cool for the tenant, and even if the landlord likes it and says, oh, well, this is cool, it doesn't mean that the tenant has a right to claim for those repairs from the landlord. This is called a claim in lien. It's almost a retention type of claim. So a retention claim would be, say, for instance, you take your car in to be serviced. The mechanic does everything he has to do, the oil changes, do the everything. And then you don't pay for the mechanic before you fetch your car. The mechanic would be entitled to hold your car as a right of retention until you pay him for his services and then release the car. So we do have the same principle in property. If you do repairs to a property, necessary, urgent repairs, and you couldn't get the owner's consent to do it, but it was crucial that you do that, then you, as the tenant, will have a right of retention against the owner for those repairs. But this is massively unlikely to happen. The only case I've had before where this happened is my client was actually the tenant, and I know I always say SSLR won't easily act against the landlord. We always act on behalf of the landlord. But in this particular case, I actually acted for the tenant, because what happened was the landlord is abroad, living, I can't remember which country, living abroad, and doesn't really care too much about the property. And the property was here in Johannesburg in Eagle Canyon, and the drainage system wasn't working as well as it should have. And there was a long rain situation. I think this was about 2014, 2013. A lot of rain, and the wall by the front door collapsed completely because of this drainage issue, which meant the place was wide open, like anybody could walk in and out. A wall collapsed. We tried to make contact with the landlord, couldn't get hold of the landlord. I told the tenant to get a contractor out, fix the problem, build the place up, and then we did a demand to the landlord and said, we had to fix this place for you while we couldn't get hold of you. We had to litigate a little bit, but long story short, the tenant won that case, but it was a necessary improvement. The wall collapsed. This is very different from a tenant installing a ceiling fan, and now he's like, it was really necessary, I was super hard, now you have to pay me. It's not the same thing. A claim in lien will only be successful when you can prove that it was a necessary improvement to make. And if it wasn't for that improvement or repair, the place would have lost value and it would have caused massive damage. But what happens if the tenant does a change now to a property without the landlord's permission? Okay, we hear that you can't claim for the repairs from the landlord, but what happens then? Any improvements forms part of the premises. Anything that is attached and becomes part of the premises becomes the landlord's property because it attaches to the property, but within logical limits. So what I'm saying is, if somebody hangs a wall clock against the wall, yes, it attaches to the property for the time being, but there's no damage when you remove it. If you have a tenant, for instance, bringing in a massive pot plant, a tree in a pot, yes, it's true, it's going to cause a bit of damage to the tiles when you move the pot, but you can clean it and it doesn't become part of the property. The test here is, will removing this item cause physical damage to the property? Will there be paint that is going to come off? Will there be actual damage if you remove this? If the answer is yes, then it becomes the property of the landlord. And if the tenant didn't have written consent in terms of the lease agreement by the landlord to attend to those the amendments and changes to the property, the tenant will not have a claim against the landlord for those improvements. So I have a few examples. For instance, if you put up a curtain rail, it becomes part of the property and the tenant can't remove that from the premises and he will have to leave it there. And if the landlord didn't give him written consent to make those improvements, unfortunately, he will not have a successful claim against the landlord for those repairs for those changes and amendments to the property. If, however, you do something like you have a portable tool shed or a gas braai, that's like a portable thing, the fact that it's cool while it's there, and it might even cause a little bit of damage, and I'm going to call this, wait for my lawyer terminology here, standing damage. if you put something down on the grass like a shed or a gas braai and the grass dies under it, it doesn't mean it becomes part of the property. So even if it causes a bit of damage, the landlord will be able to hold the tenant liable for the damage caused by this item brought onto the premises by the tenant, but the tenant will have the right to remove that because it never actually became part of the property. So that will be your test. If something can be removed easily without issues, even if it leaves a little bit of dirt or damage behind, that is the tenant's property. However, the moment it forms part of the property now, like a curtain rail, something that's bolted into a wall, something that's built on, that becomes part of the property. And if the landlord didn't give written consent for the tenant to do that and confirm that he will compensate the tenant for that, unfortunately, it's the tenant's loss, even though it became the property of the landlord. Alrighty, then last one is, can we charge a fee if a tenant pays the rent in cash? The reason for this question is obviously bank charges are pretty impressive when it comes to cash payments. So it's definitely more expensive for the landlord to receive cash into his bank account instead of an EFT or a debit order, whatever the case might be. How do we charge that cash payment penalty? Not penalty, cash payment fee from the tenant? Well, depends on your lease agreement. So because you guys are all on the TPN leaseback lease, go have a look at your clause 10.3.3. What we're saying is the tenant must repay the landlord or the agent for any bank charges resulting from any payment made by the tenant to the landlord or the agent. So what we're saying is, if the tenant receives his money in a different country and there's a forex payment, those forex charges can be charged directly to the tenant. If he makes cash payments, the charges that you get charged by the bank, that can go on the tenant's invoice for the next month every single time. Question is, do we charge that as a percentage or do we charge it as a fixed fee? The best practice answer is none of the above. You charge the actual charge that you can prove on your bank statement. This was the charge to receive this payment, and that charge you pass on exactly as that to the tenant. Now, this is my best practice answer. Your practical answer might look different. And as long as you can demonstrate to the tenant that you are paying this charge and I can link it to the actual expense I had to receive the rental payment, then you are allowed to charge it as you see fit. But my recommendation would be 100% if you can back that with your bank statement showing it ended up costing me this much to get your money into my account, you can charge that on to the tenant. So on that extremely high note, this was fun, and I hope we've covered a few important topics. It was definitely my shortest training session for the year so far, but I hope it helps, and I hope that we know exactly how to handle new curtain rails and gas braais after this training session. And I look forward to seeing you again in November for a general Q&A. But I hope you enjoyed this one, and I hope it will make your rental journey a little easier.